Chapter 3 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Craig Van Ness. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3. By John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 3. The Surrender Program. Not alone in the affair of the 40 muskets, but in the decisions and instructions concerning almost every point of inquiry which was referred to Washington, did the government exert its discouraging and paralyzing influence upon the Union commander and his loyal officers and men at Charleston. Under his general instructions to initiate no collision, Major Anderson was constantly beset with perplexing questions upon minor details. Thus, for instance, he reported that within easy musket shot of the eastern wall of Moultrie Anderson were several sand hillocks, which offer admirable cover to approaching parties and would be formidable points for sharpshooters. Would leveling these sand hills be construed as initiating a collision? Again, I would thank you to also inform me under what circumstances I would be justified in setting fire to or destroying the houses which afford dangerous shelter to an enemy, and whether I would be justified in firing upon an armed body which may be seen approaching our works. And not only his own precautions, but the aggressive preparations of the Charlestonians were from time to time thrusting upon his attention irritating conflicts of jurisdiction. Captain Foster informs me, he wrote, that an adjutant of a South Carolina regiment applied to him for Anderson his rolls of workmen, stating that he wished to enroll the men for military duty. The captain told him that they had no right to do it, as the men were in the pay of the United States government. What should he do if the state authorities demanded these men from Captain Foster? All these questions were duly considered by the War Department, and under date of September 14th, Secretary Floyd, through Adjutant General Samuel Cooper, afterwards of the rebel army, proceeded to answer them with a particularity, a gravity, and a show of reasoning which mark the communication as a piece of delicate irony. The sandhills and houses were not to be touched, and the workmen were to be surrendered on demand. Different circumstances can be imagined which might have justified the passiveness which Anderson was here enjoined to observe. Had his original discretion been left free and unhampered, had he received a single word of loyal prompting or encouragement, had he been reinforced according to his urgent demand, or had he possessed a sufficient garrison to work his guns, man his walls, and throw out skirmishers and picket guards, these instructions would perhaps have been no serious embarrassment. But under the impending coup de main from Charleston, which, if it came at all, would come in overwhelming numbers, and with only 60 men to guard 1,500 feet of rampart, these restrictions from the Secretary were little less than a formal delivery of the work to the assailants. Before he could see the tiger's teeth, he would be in the tiger's mouth. A remarkable coincidence of dates must at this point not be allowed to escape attention. The significant Buell order was given about the time of the President's truce with the South Carolina members. The Sand Hill instructions were written on the day of General Cass's retirement from the Cabinet and the issuing of the first rebel manifesto, and now on December 21st, the day after the adoption of the secession ordinance, Secretary Floyd signalized his official life by another effort to make the bloodless victory of the rebellion in South Carolina entirely easy and complete. Up to this point, the secret intrigues of the conspiracy were carried on cautiously step by step, until peaceable secession under alleged state authority advanced from vague theory to accomplished practical fact, so far as unopposed popular action could bring it about. They had not only kept the government on the defensive, they had actually rendered it defenseless, and the logic of its attitude indicated a willingness to be forced by further pressure of necessity to relinquish its hold upon the Charleston forts. By his rupture with General Cass, the President apparently conceded the proposition that the forts were simply property, which South Carolina could bargain for without offense, and the United States sell without disgrace. But the conspirators were not satisfied with this hopeful prospect of bringing about the complete political disenthrallment of the Palmetto State. they had boastfully announced their determination to have the forts after succession, and the zeal of their adherents would not suffer them to abate or delay the fulfillment of this promised conquest. Everything was ready to give South Carolina easy possession. Coercion denied and reinforcements refused at Washington, secession proclaimed, volunteer companies and scaling ladders ready in Charleston, Anderson fettered with secret instructions in Moultrie, and in Sumter and Pinckney each only a single ordnance sergeant, whose solitary musket had been angrily ordered back to the Charleston arsenal by Secretary Floyd, leaving them armed with nothing but worsted epaulets on their shoulders and stripes down their pantaloons to represent the sovereignty and military power of the United States of America. The formal demand of the forts by the commission already dispatched to Washington by the convention would terminate the presidential truce, and then half a night's campaign and the lives of a score of the Charlestonians whose fingers were itching to plant the scaling ladders against the walls of Moultrie would display the palmetto banner from every flagstaff in the harbor. Nevertheless, the more they prompted their newspaper scribblers and street corner oracles to clamor for violence and bloodshed in public, the more the conspirators in secret feared and deprecated it. For they could not fail to see in it the reaction of the public endurance, the arousing of the government and the North, and the premature and fatal destruction of their hitherto successful intrigue. The correspondence discloses, quite incidentally, that on the 21st of December, the day after the adoption of the formal secessionist ordinance at Charleston, Secretary Floyd for the first time brought to the notice of President Buchanan the secret order which he had sent by Major Buell to Anderson, on his own responsibility, 10 days before. Why did the Secretary on the 21st show the President a document which he ought to have submitted to him for approval on the 11th? The inference is that it was for an object, and the object appears in the action taken by the President, which action he has recorded as follows. The President, having observed that Major Buell, in reducing to writing at Fort Moultrie the instructions he had verbally received, required Major Anderson, in case of attack, to defend himself to the last extremity, immediately causing the Secretary of War to modify this instruction. This extreme was not required by any principle of military honor or by any rule of war. It was sufficient for him to defend himself until no reasonable hope should remain of saving the fort. The instructions were accordingly so modified with the approbation of General Scott. If, as here alleged, General Scott gave his approbation, it must have been only to the general direction and not the specific language employed, for we have his recorded assertion that the War Department has kept secret from the general the instructions sent to the major. The probability is that Floyd did not further consult either the general or the president, for he personally wrote to Anderson as follows: Sir, in the verbal instructions communicated to you by Major Buell, you are directed to hold possession of the forts in the harbor of Charleston, and if attacked, to defend yourself to the last extremity. Under these instructions, you might infer that you are required to make a vain and useless sacrifice of your own life and the lives of the men under your command upon a mere point of honor. This is far from the President's intentions. You are to exercise a sound military discretion on this subject. It is neither expected nor desired that you should expose your own life or that of your men in a hopeless conflict in defense of these forts. If they are invested or attacked by a force so superior that resistance would, in your judgment, be a useless waste of life, it will be your duty to yield to necessity and make the best terms in your power. This will be the conduct of an honorable, brave, and humane officer, and you will be fully justified in such action. These orders are strictly confidential, and not to be communicated even to the officers under your command without close necessity. It is scarcely required to instruct an intelligent American officer in our day that no professional duty requires him to sacrifice himself or his men upon any trifling point of honor. Self-respect and soldierly dignity, if not history and example, teach him the obvious truth. So far, then, from being a humanitarian precaution, the order seems plainly to have been worded to prepare the mind of Anderson for that easy surrender of his post which was now clearly the next step in the conspirators' program, To them it doubtless appeared sure to follow as the natural and necessary sequence of their previous successes. At their bidding, the President and Cabinet had created a fatal necessity. And now came Floyd's order to the practical effect that after a threatened attack or investment by a South Carolina army, which they would take due pains to make superior and overwhelming, after a show of force with stage parade and flourish of trumpets, Anderson should yield to necessity and make the best terms in his power, march out with military courtesies, and give to South Carolina Moultrie, Pinckney, Sumter, Charleston Harbor, and de facto independence. Then, under the same military necessity, aggravated and amplified by similar concerted seizures in other states, a yielding president and a cabinet dominated by treachery should negotiate a settlement. Congress might ratify, and then a distracted and despondent North accept the accomplished revolution. It was a brilliant plot, but with many flaws, and one of the greatest was that they counted without Anderson. Or rather, let us do them the justice to say, their intrigue seemed to them so complete, their control of the President and the War Department so absolute, that there appeared no reasonable chance that Anderson could become a marplot. The situation required no complicity on his part. He had but to tread the path of professional duty as marked out by Floyd, who had told him in plain words that the avoidance of a hopeless conflict in defense of these forts was the duty of an honorable, brave, and humane officer. There remained therefore but one danger, namely that Anderson might transfer his force to Sumter. This point, too, they had effectually guarded. The Buell order was a virtual official prohibition until there should occur an attack or an attempt to take possession of either one of them, and was so regarded by Anderson himself. The workmen in the forts were openly in sympathy with the secessionists. The 40 muskets had been taken out of Foster's hands, and an espionage was kept up night and day as the critical time approached, by which the Charleston authorities were fully and credibly informed that not an additional man nor gun had been sent there. It was their false security on this latter point which in the event made the transfer a success for Anderson and a complete surprise and discomfiture to the conspirators. On the very day when it occurred, Secretary Floyd himself, reading Foster's report that rebel steamers were standing guard over Sumter and that he was constructing traverses on the parapets of Moultrie to intercept sharpshooters' bullets from the sandhills, the dissembling secretary pronounced the news very satisfactory, and expressed his evidently genuine hope and belief that we should get over these troubles without bloodshed. Anderson had been petted and lionized socially by the Charlestonians, but his soldierly reserve and loyalty to his flag came through the blandishments of Southern hospitality without a taint or whisper of suspicion. He kept his own secrets from his secessionist friends by choice and necessity, from his subordinates by the special injunction of Floyd, debating anxiously in his mind how he might keep the peace and save his honor. He was familiar with the unvarying Charleston threat that they must have the forts after secession, and now that the ordinance was duly passed and proclaimed, the indications of their earnest pursuit of this scheme began to multiply. On the day of the passage of the ordinance, Governor Pickens inquired with great particularity and emphasis, through the medium of the serviceable military storekeeper, Humphreys, whether 20 enlisted men had not been sent from Moultrie to Sumter, and desired an authoritative contradiction of the rumor by night. Foster replied, indignantly testing against the right to ask such a question by a state in avowed rebellion, nevertheless gave the denial to Humphreys, still a brother officer, and of course the governor received the coveted information. On December 22nd, Anderson wrote, "I have heard from several sources that last night and the night before a steamer was stationed between this island and Fort Sumter, that the authorities of South Carolina are determined to prevent, if possible, any troops from being placed in that fort, and that they will seize upon that most important work as soon as they think there is reasonable ground for a doubt whether it will be turned over to the state. I do not doubt. No one can tell what will be done. They may defer action until their commissioners return from Washington, or if apprised by the nature of the debates in Congress that their demands will not probably be acceded to, they may act without waiting for them. I do not think that we can rely upon any assurances. and wish to God I only had men enough here to man fully my guns. P.S. I have just heard that several of the men at work in Fort Sumter wear the blue cockade. Under the same date, Foster reports the movements of the guard steamers in further detail, and says that when one of them was hailed by the night watch on Castle Pinckney as to what she wanted, someone replied, "You will know in a week." All Major Anderson's dispatches prove that he was from the very first keenly alive to his situation and possible fate. He had now for a whole month been on the rack of doubt as to the propriety of every word and act, of anxious expectancy concerning the final course of the government and nature of the instructions that might come, and it is not too violent a presumption to add, of despondency at the neglect with which he had been treated. He had from the first recognized that his handful of men ought for more successful resistance to be in Sumter. He had discussed the question with his officers, who had also advocated the removal, intimating to them that only his restraining orders kept him in Moultrie. Postpone it or decide against it as he might, the paramount necessity forced itself anew upon his attention with every day's developments, with every fresh menace. By a very pointed suggestion, Anderson asked December 22nd for instructions from the War Department for a movement from Moultrie to Sumter, but found no response in the hopes and designs of Secretary Floyd. In spite of all question and resistance, however, the idea finally conquered him. In due time, doubt grew into conviction, and conviction into resolve. Meantime, the officers in Moultrie freely visited the city, and occasionally exchanged social courtesies with leading secessionists with many mutual protestations of high regard. "We appreciate your position," said their entertainers. "It is a point of honor with you to hold the fort, but a political necessity obliges us to take it." But after the passage of the Ordinance of Secession, Major Anderson ceased his visits to Charleston. Christmas Day, however, was once more celebrated with such social amenities. Major Anderson, his officers, and many Charleston secessionists being together present at a family party given by Captain Foster and his wife at their residence in Moultrieville, a small village on Sullivan's Island, conveniently near the fort, where husbands, wives, and children, forgetting all thoughts of war, gave themselves to the unreserved enjoyment of the kindly festivities appropriate to the day of peace and goodwill. To this temporary general happiness Major Anderson formed a notable exception. His mind was burdened with a heavy responsibility, in the resolve which he had taken 10 days before to transfer his garrison to Fort Sumter, and in the secret arrangements he had been making to carry out that intention. "I promised to go to Captain Foster's for a little while tonight," he wrote to his wife on Christmas evening, "but have really no inclination whatever to do so. I am sorry I have no Christmas gift to offer you. Never mind. The day may very soon come when I shall do something which will gratify you enough to make amends for all the anxiety you now feel on my account." Nevertheless, he went to the party in order to disarm suspicion of there being anything unusual in the air, to divert from himself the too close attention of his officers, lest they might discover signs of the preoccupation which filled his mind. When Anderson returned from that scene of merrymaking to the suggestive contrast of his quarters in Fort Moultrie, it was to make a final study and review of his plans, and to calculate the chances, promising indeed, but by no means as assuring as he could have wished, that he and his whole command would spend the following night within the protecting walls of Fort Sumter. End of Chapter 3.